than you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you made the pass, yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 11. Thanks for joining me. Go to inallairness.com for show notes and plenty more features. The social hub for the podcast is facebook.com/inallairness. If you haven't already, please like the page and join the growing community of fans. Add the podcast to your RSS feed or iTunes so you never miss another show. It's also available on Stitcher, BlackBerry, Player FM, TuneIn Radio, and numerous other podcatchers. I love hearing from listeners. On either site, you can send voicemail comments or questions. With your permission, I'd love to include your feedback on future episodes. You can follow me on Twitter @InAllAirness.
My guest today spent almost 30 years working with the Chicago Tribune. He is now a columnist for Bulls.com. He authored the classic New York Times best-selling book, The Jordan Rules, and was recently inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame for his contributions to the game. Sam Smith, thanks for joining me.
Sure. I'll add for myself that got a ebook version of the Jordan Rules out now. Just came out with a new chapter that's a behind-the-scenes story of the writing of the book and Jordan's response and a whole lot of things like that that never really talked about. So if anyone wants to follow up on that, I think any of those things that get ebooks, I'm not sure I have one, but I think you can get it on.
That sounds fantastic. Do you mind just detailing a little bit more about what actually you have included as the extra chapter, please?
Well, it was a very controversial book when it came out in 1991 after the Bulls. It was supposed to be essentially, it was just going to be a diary of a season with a team, and it turns out that the Bulls ended up winning their first title. But when I started it, they weren't. Back then, in the late 80s and into the early 90s, the Bulls couldn't get past the Pistons, and it's probably hard for a lot of people to believe, but Jordan was viewed kind of as just a big scorer, kind of like maybe a George Gervin, and that he would never win championships because he was a leading scorer in the league, sort of like Wilt. Bill Russell won all the titles, and Wilt got all the scoring titles, and Jordan was viewed that way back then by Magic and Bird and a lot of guys who were winning titles. Obviously, we know everything changed, but as far as the book and what I ended up writing, it was very controversial at the time, and it was viewed, I didn't write it that way, and reading it, you wouldn't find it that way, but it was viewed as a negative toward Jordan, and, so there was a lot of controversy about his reaction to it, which I really never been written or talked about. So I went into that, and also the genesis of the book, how it got going, and what were the ramifications and fallouts from it. So a lot of things that sort of supplement the story of that first championship season, which essentially the book was a diary of that season. I used to travel with the team back then.
That's fantastic. So that's available now with that extra chapter on ebook?
Yes.
Great. I'll put a link to that in my show notes when I put it up online. Now, before we talk all things hoops, let's briefly discuss your early career with the Chicago Tribune. When you first started at the Tribune, you initially were covering politics and business. How long were you in that role for before the opportunity to write sports features came about?
It was really serendipity. A lot of things happen in life. I worked in Washington, D.C. as a political writer from the mid-'70s, about 75. I covered the Jimmy Carter administration, covered Congress and the White House. And then I moved to Chicago in 1979, late 79, early 80, and was doing some politics, mostly politics and national affairs, American and national affairs for the Tribune. Yes, I also did some business. I had a business major in college, which is why I became a journalist, because I was not a good business major. And no, it really wasn't. I wanted to become a journalist anyway, and fortunately it worked out. And then when I worked in the business staff for a while, they'd asked me to do it because I had this business background, and it was sort of a compromise thing. And then I did it for a while, and they said, okay, well, you did that, and we owe you now. Is there somewhere, you want to go back and do your political stuff? I said, nah, I'd like to give sports a try. And This was about 1982, I think it was, and I wrote for the Tribune, had a Sunday magazine then, and one of the first stories I did on the basketball minor leagues, which is then the CBA, and ended up going and spent the weekend out in Albany, New York, the capital of New York, with Phil Jackson, who was then coaching the Albany Patroons because he couldn't even get an interview for an NBA job. And I got to know Phil, and he ended up a few years later on the staff of the Bulls as an assistant and eventually head coach. So and that was fortunate, and newspaper asked me to, I had interest in basketball always and played it as a kid and grew up in New York City, and I went to Madison Square Garden all the time, saw Wilt play there and Oscar Robertson and Bill Russell and all the guys who would beat my team, the Knicks, something familiar to me. And just out of good fortune, I ended up working around the Bulls when Jordan showed up. So essentially, I started doing a lot of Bulls work, initially sort of part-time. I was full-time with the paper, but as a sort of a backup to the main beat writer for a while, and then became the beat writer and the NBA writer. But I started pretty much around exactly when Jordan came to Chicago. So again, good fortune more than anything, being in the right place at the right time.
Certainly was. Now, Jordan's rookie season was the 1985 NBA season. I've read that MJ was very accessible to the media in his early years with the Bulls. Can you please talk about your first meeting with MJ, if you can recall it specifically, and what experiences you had covering him during his Rookie of the Year season in 1985?
And Michael always likened as a man's man kind of guy. It was, just kind of fun to be around Michael, because everything was a contest, from having the last word in a conversation, which Michael always pretty much demanded, to whatever. If you were a good ping pong player, which one of his teammates was, Michael went out, and he used to get beaten, and he went out and bought a ping pong table and kept practicing until he could get better. And so it was just fun to hang around with him. And he really, now because his celebrity has gotten so big, it's not practical for him to sort of mingle that much. But he wasn't the first pick in the draft back then. All the teams were trying to get Akeem Olajuwon, number one. I remember the draft when Jordan got drafted in 1984, and after the draft, the Bulls had a series of terrible drafts, and Quentin Daly, who they drafted right after he had pleaded to a sexual assault, and David Greenwood, who they lost. He used to be a coin flip. They lost the coin flip. The Lakers won it and got Magic Johnson, and they got David Greenwood, Sidney Green, and Ronnie Lester. One bad pick after the next. So I remember when they picked Jordan, Rod Thorne said everyone, because he was College Player of the Year, even though he averaged 17 points at North Carolina. But in 1982, he had that game-winning shot, won the national championship with the last shot. So they said, well, now Bulls finally have a great player. And Rod Thorne was the general manager, said, well, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. He's going to be a really good player, but he's not the kind of player that turns around your team. So in effect, nobody really knew, back then. So, he wasn't this huge star, and back then the media wasn't nearly as big as an intrusive it had certainly become. And my first meeting with Jordan, I'd gone right after he got to Chicago. I think it was his first week in Chicago. I went to spend a day with him for a feature type story. And I got to he was living in we call a townhouse, which is like a duplex, 2 floors and a basement, but attached to another building. And he had an ironing board out. And I kind of laughed, partially because I can't iron. And I said, what are you doing with an ironing board? Because, he had his first contract, and it doesn't seem that big now, but it was 7 years, $6.3 million. So it was he was making about $900,000 a year. I was making, I think, 20. So he said, no, I iron all my clothes. I said, I don't even know how to do that. He said, well, I took home economics course in high school because he said I was always so insecure and always felt I was ugly, and I never felt I'd be able to get married because, I wouldn't be attractive to girls. So I learned how to sew and iron and cook and those things in high school class. So, pretty regular guy, just fun to be around. And I played golf with him back then, and because I'd gotten to travel with the team and dinner with him, and just sort of just like you and me, except talented. He could jump, and I mean, a spectacular player from the beginning. First time story with the first, and Rod Thorne had made all these bad draft picks, which I alluded to, and he missed the first day of practice when Jordan came to training camp, and Kevin Lockery was the coach. And after the first practice, Thorne wasn't there, and Kevin Lockery called Thorne, the general manager, and said, "Well, you finally didn't mess up the draft." So, and we could see he was a terrific talent, and just a very friendly, outgoing, really a joy to be around.
Yeah, some great stories there for sure. Now, Jordan went down with a broken foot early in the '86 season, and he missed 64 regular season games, but he willed himself back onto the team, culminating with his Herculean 63-point performance against the Celtics in the NBA playoffs. I've since read online that you said he was back in North Carolina during that time, or close to his comeback, playing some pickup games in North Carolina. So how closely were you working with the team during that season, and what access to MJ did you have whilst he was injured?
Well, really had none, because he had left the team and went back to North Carolina, and the rest of us were hanging around the team. The NBA, still required you to play those 82 games, whether Michael was there or not. So, we didn't see him. The team actually didn't want him to play the rest of the season. Michael kind of accused them of doing that so they could get a better draft pick, but they really weren't. The team doctors had told him that there was a chance with this injury where the broken bone was, that if he did it again, he would never be able to play. And there was a 10% chance of that happening. And the team really didn't want him to play, but Jordan he wanted to play. I mean, he was, a great competitor, and basically was already playing. He was playing pickup games back in North Carolina, unbeknownst to the team. There's a famous story. They told him, when I was a 10% chance, you'll never play again if you break it. He said, well, that means a 90% chance I won't. So I'll take that odds. Michael being a pretty famous gambler. But he came back and played, and initially they had him on a minutes limit, which was kind of troublesome. But by the time the playoffs came, that was over with. And as you say, had a 63-point game against Boston, the overtime game, but they ended up being swept. That was a great Boston team that won a championship, probably as good a Boston team as there ever was, probably. I remember they were 40-1 at home that season in the regular season, and pretty unbeatable. Yeah,
and they were obviously stacked with 3 future Hall of Famers as well. Prior to the 1988 NBA season, as you mentioned, you started covering the Bulls full-time. Phil Jackson was named an assistant coach around that same time. I read that you also had a very brief, by chance, conversation with Phil when he was a Knicks player back in the late 1960s. However, as you said as well, your paths crossed professionally in the early 80s when he was with the CBA. Can you please talk about your relationship with Phil over the many years that has happened since?
Well, I feel very fortunate that I've been able to develop a friendship with Phil. He's one of the most unique people I've ever met. And as I said, I worked in Washington, D.C. and covered the White House and Congress for media, and been in sports for a long time. And I have to say, Phil's probably the only person I've ever spent time with anywhere in all those kinds. That every time I have a conversation with him, I come away knowing something I didn't before, or thinking about something more so thinking about something. Really, just a tremendously interesting guy. Very shy, actually, and that's why he doesn't do a lot of media things. I mean, he did it with teams, and he would talk, but he isn't kind of inherently a shy person, and doesn't like to be out in public, doesn't do autograph things, and doesn't do a lot of that. But again, I met him I saw him that one time when I was at a Knick game. Literally, I would run back then. The players were more like us, other than the talent, as I said, but. Phil would take the subway in New York back to where he lived in Lower Manhattan, and I lived in Brooklyn, and I would take the subway. So I ran into him one time after a game getting on the subway. So I don't know. He said he didn't remember that. Probably it was a bigger thing for me than him.
Yeah.
But then as I said, I got to meet him in the CBA, and then when he came to the Bulls, I spent a lot of time with him talking about basketball, because he really was probably more instrumental in teaching me the game, or even though I knew it, you never really know it until you're around somebody who's experienced it like he has, and also a very bright guy. And so I spend a lot of time with him, asking him a lot of questions about the game and talking about plays and situations. And so I got close to him when he was with the Bulls, when he was assistant coach. And, from there, just developed a friendship over the years. And when I go to L.A., I'll usually have dinner with him. I'll be out there next month, and I'll see him for dinner when I'm out there, and email with him pretty much about once a month or every couple of weeks or something. So it's been, good fortune for me to have. It's always good fortune in your life when you get to run across and have relationships with a lot of interesting people, and he's certainly one of them.
Certainly, it's a long-lasting relationship which stretched well beyond basketball, which is great to hear as well.
Yes.
I watched a lot of Bulls TV coverage of the Jordan era, even though I am in Australia. Aside from you and names like Tom Dorr, who was a former guest on my podcast, Wayne Larrabee, Dan Roan, Rich King, Steve Cashel, Norm Van Leer, and Lou Canellis, all those names come to mind. Can you please spend just a moment talking about two of the all-time greats, not just in Chicago, but around America, Johnny Red Kerr and Jim Durham, and what your experiences were with those two late greats of the game?
Well, they were a broadcasting team with the Bulls from probably the mid-'70s, and to Jim Durham left the Bulls after the first title in '91, and Johnny died a few years back. I was very close with Johnny. I had a long history in Chicago. Jim was from a small farm town. He just died suddenly, shockingly, really, late last year, I think it was. Johnny was sort of was really a quintessential Chicago figure. Grew up in Chicago and led his team to a high school championship, played at the University of Illinois, the state university. His first time they ever went to the Final Four was with him, and then he went to Syracuse in the NBA. When he got drafted, they won a title his first year there. He was the original Iron Man of the NBA, played 844 straight games. The first game he missed was in his last season. The season he was going to retire because the coach just didn't play him because his coach didn't want any more talk about his streak. So he ended it, bad guy, basically. But then Johnny came and coached the Bulls expansion team in 1966-67, and that's still the only NBA expansion team in the history of the league to make the playoffs. And then he became a broadcaster and really was a great ambassador for the game and for Chicago, and sort of the ultimate guy next door. He was everybody's friend. From what I know about, I've never been to Australia, but from what I know from Luke Longley and the Australian players who've been through the NBA, he was a guy Australians would love, because Johnny was a guy who'd sit down and have a beer with anybody, and you'd feel like you were his best friend. And Jim Durham was just one of the great broadcasting pros in the NBA, great love of the game, went on to be a national broadcaster for ESPN after he worked with the Bulls, and it's a great loss for not to have either of those guys around anymore.
Sure is, and definitely both their voices are synonymous with some amazing Michael Jordan moments, but also just NBA moments in general, and they're very sadly missed to this day. I reread your excellent book, The Jordan Rules, prior to our chat today. In a passage about the shot, Jordan's Game 5 heroics versus Cleveland in 1989, you describe a fascinating moment where Doug Collins begins drawing up a play for Dave Corzine in that final timeout with just 3 seconds remaining. Can you please describe what happens next, just perhaps minus the expletive?
Yeah, well, Doug was, because everybody expected Michael to get the ball, Doug was thinking about, maybe we should run something, to get a good open shot, because they're going to be doubling and tripling Michael Jordan. And Michael stopped that right away, and he said, just get me the ball. I'll take care of it from there. And it's something that we've overheard in huddles quite a bit over the years, but that was, such a really seminal moment for the franchise, because the Cavs back then were viewed as the team that the Bulls became. They were supposed to be the team of the 90s. In fact, Magic Johnson that season, and they had a great team with Mark Price and Brad Daugherty and Larry Nance. Magic Johnson said this is going to be the NBA team of the 90s. Played great team ball, and in fact that season they were 6-0 against the Bulls. I mean, the Bulls never even came close to beating them once, one game that regular season, and the Bulls finished 6th that year in the regular season. So again, Jordan wasn't considered, the player that we all knew him eventually became. And so that really was the beginning of the run. If Jordan hadn't made that shot, there was a chance that there was a pretty good chance the Bulls would have broken up the team. Would have traded Pippen and or Grant, would have made some major changes. And they ended up going to conference finals. They beat the Knicks the next round and then took Detroit, eventual champion, the 6 games. And so that shot probably was the biggest shot in the history of the franchise, even though Jordan won championships with other shots in '98 particularly. That one really set the team on the way to the 6 championships it would get.
One of the most replayed moments in all of sports, for sure, and it's an incredible recount of what actually did happen just moments before the shot. Now, in Jordan's post-game interview with James Brown, following that game, he talked about some Chicago writers who had written off the Bulls in their first-round matchup. What do you remember about the treatment that the Bulls actually received from the local press during that playoff series?
Well, he was talking about 3 of us. I was one. Before the series started, as I said, Cleveland had dominated the Bulls in that season. In the last game of the regular season, Cleveland came into Chicago. Seeding was set already. The Bulls played all their starters. Cleveland didn't play their starters, just played the reserves, and the Cavs won by 18 points or something. So it was hard to even pick the Bulls. So there was three of us writers traveling with the team then. When the writers always make predictions before the playoffs start, and one of the writers picked 3 Cavs in 3. It was best of 5 then. One picked 4, and I picked Cavs in 5. So before the game 5, it was 2-2. In fact, Jordan really messed up game 4. He missed 2 free throws at the end of game 4, would have won the game, and now the Bulls were going back for the deciding game in Cleveland. So it looked like Jordan had kind of choked away the series. So anyway, it was before game 5, and Jordan always had this ultimate confidence. He never thought he would lose. And so he's sitting on the scorer's table and right next to the bench where we were sitting, and he points to the guy who picked 3, and he says, "We took care of you." He points to the guy who picked the Cavs in 4. He points to him, he says, "We took care of you." And then he pointed to me, and he said, "We take care of you today." And they did.
He's obviously very confident in his abilities and probably the greatest of all time in terms of being able to back up what he
Yes, very confident guy.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, in the Jordan rules, you mentioned that MJ almost considered attending the University of South Carolina or Clemson because they said he could be a 2-sport player, basketball and baseball. Prior to MJ's first retirement in October '93, how much talk, if any, did you hear about his wants to pursue Major League Baseball?
We never thought he would, but there was talk, and in fact, I forget which summer it was. It was like '89. It was before they won a title. His father wanted him to try baseball, and he was pretty good when he was like 12 years old. I think he played in like a National Little League Championship and pitched a 1-hitter or something. But he was a very good baseball player as a little kid. Kind of got away from it into basketball. They made a contact in one of those summers, like the summer of '89 and the summer of '90, for him to play that summer with a team in somewhere in North Carolina. I don't know if it was Charlotte, Wilmington. There was a minor league single A team, and they were talking to him about playing in the summer there. Okay. And so, he had that in the back of his mind for some time. It seemed like a fantasy, and none of us ever thought it would occur. He did. And of course, with Jordan, he always used to talk about it and said, how good he would do.
I never knew it was possibly looking at playing in some sort of minor league or wherever it might have been in North Carolina there. So that's really interesting to hear. Thanks for telling me about that. Now, looking back, it's been over 20 years since the Jordan Rules was released. Your acknowledgements section at the back of the book eloquently details the background on the origins. Can you please just tell the listeners a little bit about the process of writing and researching for the book? You are clearly a well-credentialed reporter, but first-time author.
Well, right. What I did know is there was a book written by one of my favorite authors, David Halberstam, who written a lot of great American history and political books and wrote several sports books. And he'd written a sort of an inside story of a team kind of book about the Portland Trailblazers back in the late 70s. He happened to pick the year to be with the team after Bill Walton got hurt. So it wasn't a big seller type book, but I'd read that at the time, and it always it had been in my mind that I really never had this great desire to write a book. It was more like, I'll give it a try, because I think I could do that. It didn't seem so hard. It was like a story, but, longer. so I just thought, I'd like to give that a try, see if I can do that. And it was just because I liked this book so much, I was going to try to pattern it after that as much as I can, and write a book sort of the way Halberstam did, by getting on the inside with the team. And I could, because I traveled with the Bulls. They traveled commercial aircraft then. They didn't have private aircraft back there in the 80s. And so I was with them all the time. I was on the planes with them, PAL, team bus, all the places media cannot be anymore. You never see a book like that again, not because nobody could do it, but nobody would have the access that I had back then, or any of us really had. And so that's sort of what I just set out to do. And that's the newspaper, and then I would go to dinner or hang out with one of the players and just develop background information, travel around, do interviews, and so I would usually be about a couple of months behind on the book. It's like if it was January, I'd be talking to the guys about what happened in November, going back over situations. And so when the season ended, and they ended up winning, and we went through the finals until the end of June, and then I spent the summer pretty much finishing up the book. I kind of would write some during the season, and then I spent the summer finishing it up.
Whilst the focus of the Jordan rules is Michael Jordan, it further increased my appreciation of guys like John Paxson, B.J. Armstrong, Bill Cartwright, and Horace Grant. To this day, do people still talk to you about what they gleaned from reading your book?
It's interesting. I didn't want to write. I didn't intend to write a Jordan book, and I didn't really write a Jordan book. It was supposed to be the diary of a king, which I feel I did do, and I didn't. I wasn't looking for sales. I was just looking for the product. But when the publisher got a hold of it, they just named it for that. But really, it was like basketball, like the sport itself. It was a team approach, and I viewed it as a book about a team and all these individuals who are interesting in their own right, just not as famous and talented as Jordan. And I still, John Paxson's the general manager of the Bulls, so I see him. I write for the Bulls website now, and Bill Cartwright's been a good friend over the years. And in fact, he just took a job coaching in Japan. Horace Grant, I keep in touch with. He's been a good friend over the years. He lives in California and retired. And Scottie Pippen works for the Bulls on their business side as kind of a team ambassador, going out making appearances. So, a lot of these guys are still around, and I see them and keep in touch with them. Cliff Levingston has some sort of a camp sort of situation, basketball camp in the Chicago area, and I talk to Dennis Hobson sometimes. And so, so I've managed to keep relationships, and I think, the players understood and appreciated what I was doing. I wasn't out to embarrass anybody, but just to write a story about, what it's like to be on that team at that time.
Well, there's some fascinating insights into all the players on the roster at that time, and I was fortunate to speak with Dennis Hobson as well a few episodes ago on my podcast, and he was an interesting story with the background with New Jersey and obviously being a superstar pretty much at Ohio State. Right. Having to adjust to life on the bench with the Bulls was quite a different contrast for him. There's numerous legends of the Chicago basketball scene that didn't take up residence with the Bulls when they turned pro. Isaiah Thomas, Mark Aguirre, and Nick Anderson come to mind. I'm sure you had some opportunity to see these guys play before they joined the NBA. Can you please talk a little about the notable players that hailed from Chicago area at that time?
Well, you mentioned probably the two best. Isaiah Thomas was, we make the division of basketball about little men. And he, because he was, 5'11", I don't think he was 6 foot. Isaiah was the best player of that size to me, and I think to many others in the history of the game. Just an extraordinary player who could do everything and learn what it took to be a team player and to take a team to a title, because he's just such an extraordinary scorer, guy who could do pretty much anything with basketball, play and beat guys, all-star players, much bigger. Mm-hmm. And then Mark Aguirre, who Isaiah was close friends with, played at DePaul in Chicago, who should be in the Hall of Fame. I hope he eventually will be. He did play on 2 championship teams with Isaiah in Detroit. If he'd have stayed in Dallas and just stayed a scorer, because he gave up a lot of his game, to fit in with that Detroit team, would have been one of the great scorers ever. I mean, he was an unstoppable post scorer. That he'd get out and post, sort of like Adrian Dantley, but better, with a smooth shot. Just a tremendous talent to watch. Those two guys were just really extraordinary players, and to me, pretty much head and shoulders above. In Chicago, many great players. I think you mentioned Nick Anderson and Terry Cummings from there, but Mark and Isaiah were just really special players.
Good to hear a bit of background about them as well and what you think. Now, before we touch on the NBA of today, is it possible to choose an enduring moment that stands out above all others from your time covering the Jordan era Bulls?
I don't really get into that because it's sort of like, your favorite kid. You don't want to pick your favorite child because you really don't have one. Mm-hmm. I enjoyed all the moments as they occurred. The most special to me was with the first title because it had been such a trial, losing 3 times to Detroit, tremendous disappointments, bitter losses, and when you lose like that, and then overcome and beat the team that had been beating you, nothing sweeter, and so the feeling and the scene in Los Angeles, especially being able to do it over a legendary franchise like the Lakers, was probably I enjoyed it the most for seeing how much the Bulls enjoyed it.
They certainly seemed to be reveling in it once they had sealed the title in Game 5 there in LA. Tomorrow, the Bulls host the league-leading San Antonio Spurs, who are 9-1 in their last 10 games. What are your thoughts on the matchup?
Well, I kind of don't quite know what to make of it because Duncan and Ginobili are not playing. For Chicago, Heinrich's not playing. Noah playing for Citus, so he may play or may not play. So it's one of those games, both teams are good defensive teams. They probably have 2 of the most committed systems of play in the league, most disciplined defensively. So it's a great game to see, and obviously, of course, Derrick Rose is not back yet. So it's not meaningful in the sense of only, I think it'll be, as it is when those 2 teams play, 2 good teams that play hard, but still missing a lot of key pieces.
Speaking of possibly missing pieces, what do you think about Noah's chances of actually lacing up and playing in the All-Star game next week? Is his injury going to have quite an impact on whether or not he actually does?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he's left open the possibility that he won't play. I'm sure he'll go. He'll be there. Joe likes people and Joe likes parties, and the All-Star game is both. So he'll be there. I hope he gets out to play, at least for a little bit. Luol Deng had a minor injury last year, and he came and played about 6 minutes. So I do expect him to try at least get out there and play a little bit, if his foot is still bothering him. I mean, it's a bigger concern for the Bulls because if his foot is still bothering him to the point that he can't play in that game, and it doesn't really particularly bode well for them for the rest of the season.
Yeah, that's true. Now, speaking of Derrick Rose, I know it's obviously a merry-go-round, and it's a question that you hear time and time again, but what is the latest on Derrick and his activity with the team in terms of practice, and when do you think the slated return may in fact happen?
It's a hard one, obviously, in part because there's been no determination made by the team or the doctors telling the team when they think he can or should play. The original diagnosis, 8 to 12 months, when he got hurt at the end of April. He had a surgery May 12th of 2000. So we're just at 9 months now, so we're in the early part of it. He's going through kind of walkthroughs with the team, but he's really not practicing because they don't scrimmage. Kind of little known that Thibodeau, because they play so hard and big minutes, that he tends to lighten up in practice, and they have long practices. They go through a lot of plays and things, but they don't go through scrimmaging. So I think it's 50-50 whether Derrick even plays this season, partially because if you see the other guys who have had that same injury around that same time, Ricky Rubio, Iman Shumpert, Eric Maynor, Rubio just now, just in the last week, has started to be productive, and this is like he had his surgery, I think, in January. So this is like 13 months since his surgery.
Yep.
And Shumpert, who had injured the same day as Rose, had his surgery about 2 weeks before Rose did, has struggled a lot. And he was starting for the Knicks, and now they're thinking of taking him out of the starting lineup and playing him less because he's So it's just uncertain if you look at the evidence around that those guys have had this injury, whether it even makes sense to bring Derek back this season. I think the team is thinking about, if the doctors say he won't hurt himself further, I think there's a chance he might come back in mid-March, but I really wouldn't expect anything before that.
Okay. Well, thanks for that insight there, and perhaps in the short term they may just be best to write off the rest of this season so that he can come back as close to 100% the Derrick Rose that we know at the start of next season.
Yeah, that's what I would prefer, but nobody's asking me.
Yeah.
I'm just, like everybody else, I'm just waiting and watching to see what happens.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of interest, and we'll obviously keep following it closely as the months go on. Now, Peter Vesey, legendary reporter and columnist, and was also a recent guest on my podcast, he tweeted a fortnight or so ago about the possibility of Phil Jackson becoming the front office face of a Seattle franchise should a deal be done to lure a team from Sacramento. What is your take on this, given your strong ties to Phil?
I think that's possible. He has a relationship with the people who have made an offer to buy the team.
Yes.
Who haven't been approved yet, and Sacramento is still trying to find somebody to purchase the team to keep it in Sacramento. So, I think it's one of the things that Phil has some interest in, and it's a possibility, but it's a little premature because, they haven't worked out a deal yet.
Sacramento are still trying all they can to keep the team there in California, but in the event that it was to perhaps happen, then Phil may be one of the leading candidates for a role in that particular franchise.
Yeah, I can see that. He's not going to be coaching again, but he should have had that role with the Lakers. They promised him that kind of a mentoring thing for their coaching staff, front office, and then they reneged on the deal. So I think that's what he's interested in, and I think that's what he'd probably pursue. And I think, in part because he has a relationship, personal relationship with some of the investors trying to buy the new franchise, I just think it makes sense to suggest that, that's a possibility. But I know he's talked to some other teams as well.
You believe that his coaching days are certainly over?
Yes, yeah. For him, it's, he's closing in on 70 years old, and it's a grind to travel, the United States all winter long. They travel privately, aircraft, they stay in first-class hotels, but it's still, for instance, it was just 2 feet of snow on the East Coast, and all the flights were canceled, but so you had to make alternate plans. It's glamorous as it sounds, and it is glamorous, obviously, but after you've done it for so many years, and he's done it for 40 or so, it wears you, especially, Phil's had hip replacement and knee replacements, and it's just too difficult a thing, and frankly, I would try to do that again.
Now, can you please talk a little about your Hall of Fame induction last September? An amazing honour. How was it? I have watched your Hall of Fame speech up on YouTube.
Yeah.
It was a really honest speech that you gave, and obviously you were quite choked up, understandably. So can you maybe just talk a bit about that induction there, please, Sam?
Well, it was a great honour. None of us, like the players too, and I've been to a lot of Hall of Fame inductions over the years. We all get into something like this, whether it's the players playing or somebody like myself, the writing, because of the passion we have and the love for the job. And then to be honored, at that level for something that you are just grateful to be able to do and grateful to be around all these years and have the opportunity. It's just one of the most special things you could have, in your life, because it's not something it's not something you work toward or think about or want to do. You're just grateful, overwhelmingly grateful to have the opportunity to be involved, and then to be honored for something that when your kids would do for nothing, basically, is that's why it's all the same things you hear. I always hear so many people say how speechless they are because it's hard to find words for that level of honor. So it was just a great good fortune.
A tremendous honour. Now, Sam, it's been fantastic chatting with you today. Thanks so much for your wonderful insights into the game of basketball, and congratulations on what you've achieved thus far.
All right, thank you, and good luck.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and share my web address with your friends and colleagues, inallairness.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter @inallairness. Please visit the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairness. Join me next time for another edition of the show.